All right, welcome to Mad Dogs and Englishmen, Maundy Thursday edition, even for the non-believing Charles Cook. We sometimes give you a weather report, and it is another glorious day here. We only get about 20 or 25 really nice days in New York every year, and they generally tend to come in, April, May, and then sort of early fall. The rest of the time it's either Houston unbearable or Arctic frozen. But someone who is not going to be going outside, I think, and enjoying any particular athletic activities today is my friend and colleague, Charles Cook, who is nursing what looks to be a very sore and sort of claw-like hand, which has to do with the fact that he was not here yesterday to participate in this podcast. So, Charlie, tell us about your field trip.
Well, I hurt my hand in the best possible of ways, which was that I went to the Smith Wesson factory plant headquarters, what you will, in Springfield, Massachusetts yesterday. It's an imposing building. It's built in, I think, 1940. It looks like a sort of Art Deco. I don't know whether you would like it, given your tastes in
I like Art
architecture.
Deco.
You like Art Deco? It's quite brutal as well, but in an almost appealing way. And I was given a tour of the factory. It's very kind of them to offer that, and then I went to the range and shot a lot of their guns, which was great. I got my injury the fun way. Go on.
You and I are going to disagree about some stuff later.
We are.
And this is not a sponsored message, by the way. We're not getting paid by Smith Wesson to talk about this. But one thing Charlie and I do agree on is we both really like Smith Wesson revolvers. The bigger, the better. But there may be some limits on that. Sure.
Well, I fired the 357 Magnum, which I think of all the revolvers that are out there, Smith & Wesson's 357 for me is the one. I mean, it doesn't just look great, but it feels great, it fires great. It is what a revolver should be, and I think they were pleased yesterday when I told them that.
Yes.
And then we moved up to the 44 Magnum, Clint Eastwood gun, obviously, and that was pretty fun as well. It's just for me, it's just slightly too big around. I don't know how people could carry that as their default weapon.
Well, if you've got a bear problem, it's a good carry gun.
But around San Francisco, and Clint Eastwood used to carry the one with a what was it, 6-inch barrel longer?
I think it was bigger than that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really not the size of your barrel; it's how you point it.
Well, no, absolutely, but still, it's a weapon that he was carrying on him every day.
Right. Yeah.
That was quite the ask. And then it was suggested that I try the 500, which.
The elephant gun.
Right, I'm reliably informed that this can kill big game, effectively.
Yeah.
And I can see why. I mean, this is a very, very loud gun. And the gentleman who sort of was shooting with me said that when he fires his back in Arizona on the range, everybody comes over to watch and ask him what it is, which you can see, really, given that fire flies out the end when you fire it, and it is extraordinarily loud. And as I learned, having put 10 rounds through it, each of which I think is about $4 each, $5 each, you wake up the next morning and you're very aware that you fired it, especially if your hand takes most of the force. So, no, that was quite the experience. I don't think I'll be buying one for concealed carry or even for casual range plinking. I would soon bankrupt myself, but what a piece of engineering. And I learned that that's the only production revolver of its size. They're sort of custom ones or limited limited production revolvers that are built, but this is a production line revolver, so there must be a market for them.
Well, this is the company that makes Desert Eagle. Don't they make a 50 revolver like that called the BFR, which stands for Big Revolver?
I read this morning, actually, when I was looking up what had done this to my hand, that this was the only production revolver of its size. So maybe
I don't know if the 500 and the 50 are exactly comparable rounds, but yeah, huge and sort of fun to shoot. Did you shoot the one with the muzzle flash suppressor on the end, so you didn't set the range on fire, or?
To be honest with you, I don't know.
You're just shooting a flamethrower.
I'm not. I'm not an expert in firearms at all. It's law, the Constitution, the history of it philosophically is my area. I'm learning a little more, but I've focused very much on pistols. So revolvers are an area I'd love to get into, but I don't know.
Now, Springfield used to be, I think, the capital of firearms production in the United States, did it not?
Right. Well, indeed, the whole East Coast used to be the arsenal of not just the United States, but for a period the world. And a lot of the manufacturers have now moved or transferred in part down south. There's a significant amount of pressure coming from southern governors especially to transfer operations into more friendly territory. Now, when they say more friendly territory, I think they mean two things. The first is that, by and large, Southerners and Southern laws are more hospitable toward gun manufacturers. It is somewhat unreasonable, in my view, for, say, the state of New York to laud Remington as a great provider of jobs, union jobs at Remington, and profits for Massachusetts to be proud of Smith Wesson in Springfield, and yet to make many of its products illegal.
Yes,
that's a double standard that is ugly. But when they say a better business environment, some of that's on the level, some of that is not. Move down here, we have lower corporate tax rates. Great. Move down here, we have right to work. Great. Move down here, we have a better business environment in a regulatory sense. Great. Move down here and you won't pay any taxes for 10 years. It bothers me a little bit, I must confess. But nonetheless, that is what Texas and Alabama and Mississippi have been trying, and South Carolina and North Carolina have been trying to do, and reasonably effectively.
Yeah, well, New York does the same thing, though, of course, for new businesses that locate here. It's no state or local taxes at all for 10 years, right? For was it the New York Innovation Program?
Don't get me wrong, that's right. I'm not suggesting that this is just a southern thing, but I'm saying with gun manufacturers in particular, this is the South has been taking much of the Northeast's prominence.
Yeah. Is Springfield Armor still based in Springfield, or do they manufacture somewhere else now? Do you know?
I don't know, if I'm honest. I can find out.
Because they also sort of make wonderful guns. Well, I guess the other question is how did you shoot?
Actually, very well. I was surprised. It's a reasonably new shooter, and it was odd. I started off with an M&P in 22 long, and I shot completely terribly. I kept apologizing to the range master. I'm sorry, I don't know what's happening. It's way off to the left. And I thought, well, this is fun. Nobody here is judging me. It was a fun day, and it's just going to be one of those days. But then they gave me the M&P 9mm, actually the VTAC, which is a sort of souped up one, has a slightly lighter trigger pull, which is about the same as that on the short reset trigger on my SIG, and bang, bullseyes, or at least all within the middle circle.
Yeah.
And then we moved, and once I got used to the revolver, I shot pretty well, and I shot I didn't shoot the 500 pretty well because it's crazy. But I shot the 357 and the 44, and then we played with some ARs, and I shot those surprisingly well, actually, for someone who really has no experience with ARs. And I really, really want an AR, but the state of Connecticut has decided that any weapon with cosmetic features, and that is literally the law, because there's no ban on, say, a 308 bolt-action rifle. There's no ban on centerfire rifles that fire 223 or 556 cartridges. It's just if it has a folding or a telescopic stock, if it has a flash suppressor, if it has a barrel shroud, they've made it illegal for me to have one. So that will have to wait until the inevitable move to the wilds.
Well, I thought I saw on the news the other day, so somebody has introduced a New York State legal AR,
yes,
which looks like a camel. And then there's a Connecticut legal one, too, isn't there?
So those are two different things. Yeah. The New York legal AR-15 basically looks like a paintball gun because they've taken off all of the features that make ARs attractive. It's no longer customizable. It no longer has any rails. It no longer has a pistol grip. It no longer has an adjustable stock. It no longer has a flash suppressor, and so it's a center-fired, I think, 223/556 AR without any of the AR virtues, but that is nonetheless more like an AR than, say, a bolt-action rifle is.
Gotcha.
So that's the New York trick. In Connecticut, they wrote the law to such a strict degree after Newtown that basically the only thing that is legal is now the AR with a .22 in a .22 caliber.
Okay.
So you can have, the AR that you could buy in Texas with all of the features that I've just described, but only in .22. So I don't know the exact details of it, but I think what happened was that New York focused on the variables and made no mention of the caliber. And I think Connecticut said, here are the centerfire rifles that you can have.
Got it.
And so they came at it the other way around. So there's no real way around it in Connecticut.
Well, in a sense...
But I tell you what, having fired the .22 yesterday, and I thought it would be a bit... It's still a hell of a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So, I might pick one of those out.
Well, in a sense, although I don't support either regulatory approach, it makes a lot more sense to focus on calibers, which has to do with the actual power of the gun. The cosmetic obsessions of the gun regulators always made me laugh, because I used to own a Browning automatic rifle, which, I don't know if you know the BAR, but it's a very traditional-looking gun.
Sure.
It's walnut and a stock and all that sort of stuff. But it's a semi-automatic rifle in a hunting caliber, as opposed to a little, .223. So you can get this, thing in a .308 or some, enormous, moose shooting caliber. A much, much, much more dangerous gun than any of these little, plinker AR type things.
And that's the great joke of the whole thing. I mean, obviously, if you were going to focus in on philosophical and legal questions to one side, if you were going to focus in on gun control, then you would go after handguns, because disproportionately handguns are used in both suicides and in murders. It's 6,000 and 7,000 of the murders every year in this country that are committed with guns are committed with handguns. Rifles of all sorts are only between 300 and 400, and the use of so-called assault weapons within that category is so tiny that it's not even counted by the FBI. So, to start in on it at all is silly, but again, as you say, if you're going to start in on it, it is preposterous that, once you've limited the magazine size, which is another thing that the gun controllers like to do, that in Connecticut you can buy a .308 bolt-action rifle, or in fact a .308 semi-automatic rifle with a 10-round magazine that can take down a stag, but you can't buy the same thing if it happens to have a pistol grip or a stock. That, in many ways, and I don't like the way gun controllers make this argument rather than going to the heart of it, which is a question of liberty and a question of prudence and a question of good law. But one of the reasons that ARs have those features is because they make them easier to shoot. For women, for example, and for smaller people. I mean, it's much more difficult to fire a big hunting rifle for a woman than it is to fire a light AR with almost no recoil. And, given that they're used in almost no murders, it does seem preposterous. But that is the law, and I'm certainly not going to find myself in prison on a felony charge for buying or importing a weapon that I'm not allowed to. So for the moment, I shall follow the rule of law.
Right. Yeah, because if you import one, you might get deported. So that's a whole different thing. Although, I know what you want to move on to with that attempt at a segue there, but...
but you're not going to let me.
Not just quite yet. Well, just one last point on this is that, the gun controllers always say, we don't want to take away your granddad's deer rifle. We only want to go after these dangerous guns. And out of all the weapons I've owned, the deer rifles and the game rifles are by far the most dangerous weapons. As opposed to a little, .22 or .223 or something like that.
My SIG is far more dangerous if I want to commit a crime or a mass shooting than an AR-15 is. You can't conceal the AR-15. Now, presuming that people follow the law, which they don't, but the laws being passed and the people who pass them presume that their laws are going to make a difference.
Right.
So let's put an AR-15 next to my SIG, both with 10 rounds in them, which is the Connecticut standard. Which one am I more likely to take into a crime scene or into a mass shooting? Obviously the SIG, because I can conceal it. Right. I can put it in a bag, I can tuck it into my trousers, I can put it in a holster and then wear a jacket. It would be pretty difficult for me to get an AR-15 there. And then you come to the question, well, okay, but Charlie, people don't obey the laws. And then you say, well, exactly. If you want to shoot somewhere up, then you can just walk in with an AR-15, but then you're not worrying about the magazine size or whether it's legal in the state anyway. And then we come back to the problem of there are 350 million guns. Trying to micromanage them in this way is ridiculous.
Yeah. I have a very, very old shotgun that I inherited from my great-grandfather, which is not within the city limits of New York, in case anyone's listening. But, it's never been fired as far as, not in the last 50 years as far as I know. But it's got some suspicious notches carved into the stock. And where my great-grandfather lived, there was not, a lot of deer hunting or anything out there. It was kind of way out in the, in the boonies of West Texas. So I'm always a little curious about what those stand for. But yeah, a heck of a difficult thing to conceal. But of course, awkward segue, there are places in this country where people aren't bothering to conceal their guns.
My segue was so much better.
Yeah, your segue really was better, but I wasn't done talking about guns yet at that point. So, back to Clark County, Nevada, where for my sins I have spent some time, although largely in Las Vegas, and on the highways between Las Vegas and the places where prostitution is legal, not because I was partaking, but because I wrote a story about it for the magazine some time back when I was out in Vegas for the Porn Oscars, which was one of the more depressing spectacles I've ever been to in my life. I'm not an especially prudish guy, but, even at my fairly libertine standards of being offended, well, I wasn't offended, I was just sort of dismayed, I guess. So, back to Nevada, you had a piece published yesterday, I believe, National Review, in which you once again took issue with my view on the matter of Cliven Bundy and his armed but so far nonviolent standoff with the Bureau of Land Management and various other feds. And as I recall, the word indefensible played into your piece. So let's hear why it's indefensible and convince me one more time why I'm wrong.
Well, as anyone who follows me on Twitter will know, I am today two things that I am not usually. One is a Rhino Tory King George loving stooge of the state, and the second is, and not unrelated, is a favourite of the MSNBC crowd. I think yesterday MSNBC's Steve Bannon, is that his name, praised me, which gave me real pause. But I do nonetheless stand by my position here, and that is that Bundy has been treated badly by the federal government. His predicament is the product of big government, unresponsive government, ham-fisted government. It is also the product of bad homesteading in the West, where the federal government owns far too much of the land. And yes, you're right when you say, therefore, the people own the land, but the people also own the helicopters and the missiles in this country, and yet they are under the jurisdiction and the control of the government. And the theory, of course, is that we control that government and therefore it can impose its rules on us. Now, my view here is that Bundy has a great moral case and an interesting story, and should be the product, or rather the recipient of a great deal of sympathy, and that resistance to the federal government in this case is acceptable insofar as it doesn't seek just to nullify the law. Now, for those who have said, well, where would you have been in 1776, I think my attitude is not un-American or un-libertarian, but is really that of John Adams, who said in the early 1770s that he was for the law, and that was what guided him. And Adams famously, of course, defended the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre because the law was more important than the mob, but declined to join Sam Adams in calling for revolution up until the point at which the regime, not the law in question, not A law, not the T law, not the taxes, not this duty or that duty, but the regime in question became untenable, and then he sided with Adams and Jefferson, we all know the rest of the history, in calling for its absolute overthrow. Now, my objection to you and to John Hinderaker, both of whom I thought wrote moving and convincing to a point pieces about the moral case, is that Hinderaker, for example, says, well, Bundy has a really great moral case, but not a legal leg to stand on, which seems to be important, that distinction. And you quoted George Washington and Gandhi, both of whom brought down the regimes completely and would have been hanged if they had failed. Now,
probably not Gandhi.
Well, possibly not Gandhi. Winston Churchill did make some comments, but well, let's not go down that road.
Half-naked Indian fakir.
But either way, you did draw on those two figures, and they both did manage to bring down the entire regime. And my point is that it is acceptable if the regime of a nation becomes so tyrannical and so capricious to call for a revolution and to fight for that revolution, but that if we accept that Bundy has such a good and moving case that he can just opt out of the law and force the government to back down, and just as a digression here on this wasn't civil disobedience in the classic sense, was it? Civil disobedience is where you say, I'm not going to go along with the regime, and then you deal with the consequences of it. But Bundy has won this, right? Bundy has essentially got the federal government, at least for now, to say, all right, we're not going to enforce the law. He's not protesting for a change. He won his particular, and that's what he set out to do. So my point is, if Bundy can opt out because he's right, let's presume for the sake of argument that he's right here, then why can't I opt out because I'm right about about assault weapons? We just had this discussion in Connecticut. I think I'm absolutely right. I think the state of Connecticut is completely wrong. Why can't progressives opt out of the laws that they think they're right about? Why can't everybody opt out? Because you can't run a society like that.
Although I note that the great majority of your neighbors in Connecticut are in fact opting out of the state's laws and refusing to comply with them.
Right, and I think that the law is stupid.
Connecticut seems to be running just fine that way.
I think that the law is a stupid one, and I think that the government should look at its clearly being unworkable, Irish democracy I think it's called, and they should change the law. And I would hope that its being unworkable would lead to more protest and more pressure. At the same time, I don't deny that if a Connecticut state officer were to prosecute those people, that they are in violation of the law and that they have to deal with the consequences of their actions. There's a great proverb that Dan Foster taught me, which is, I think, an old Spanish proverb, which is take what you want, but pay for it. Yeah. Now, my problem here is not with the law, but it's not with the law being enforced. It was duly enacted, and I would hope it would be struck down, but again, we have courts to do that. If somebody refuses to comply with it and they think that that is worth it and worth their time and their effort, then I'd be fine with them being prosecuted in the same way as I would be greatly enamored of Bundy were he to go to prison for this. But what conservatives want in this case, and have suggested, well, in some cases explicitly, in other cases by implication, is they firstly want Bundy to win, and they want the federal government to say, fine, we'll ignore this law. And/or they want a shooting match. Now, I'm not suggesting you want a shooting match, but there has been around the edges this suggestion that, well, maybe we will fight the government over this law. And if you're going to call for a revolution, then call for a revolution, but don't justify selective obedience to the law.
Yeah, well, I think where our disagreement here is that you and I are essentially talking about different things. So you're looking at this and saying, what do we make out of this case as a matter of general principle? What can we take away from this and say we can generalize this across our politics? And I don't think I would disagree with you on that. As I said, in my piece on that this is not something that you probably want to take as a precedent for general action. But I think if you're looking at it in terms of what do we make of this thing that actually did happen, there's a specific thing that happened. Yeah, of course the law is on the other side, but it's an act that draws attention to not just a legal situation, but a political situation that needs to have attention drawn to it. And the point of civil disobedience isn't to go to jail necessarily, it's to provoke a reaction from the authorities that sheds some light on the underlying situation. Now, Bundy, of course, is an imperfect exemplar of this for a lot of ways. One, because he's making this crackpot legal argument that I don't buy at all. So if I were, taking my own first principles and back constructing, a good case of the example I would like to see, it wouldn't be this one, but this is the one that actually has. So what I'm trying to do here, I think, is take this actual thing that's going on in the world and use it to illustrate, something that's important worth talking about. Now, the idea that Bundy has won this I think is premature. I feel a little like the Chinese premier asked in the 80s what he thought about the French Revolution, and he said, too soon to tell.
Yeah.
But because I don't think he's won this. I think he's going to end up shot or in prison or one of these things, because the government is not going to take this lying down. Where I think we do disagree, though, is this. I think there is lots of room for this sort of civil disobedience, short of calling for revolution. Now,
but hang on. How do you square that with saying it shouldn't be a general principle? I mean, it strikes me that's a huge concession to say, well, yes, this case, but it shouldn't be a general principle. But then you say, but there's a lot of room for this sort of thing, and it's virtuous.
Well, yeah, I do think it's virtuous. And, as you put it in your piece, you said that, well, I think Kevin is setting himself up as the arbiter for the person who makes decisions about when this is acceptable and when it isn't. And to some extent, you're right. I think these are always case by case, matter of prudence, matter of proportion.
But isn't that precisely what we rail about as libertarians? That you can't entrust people to enforce or judge or arbitrate the laws, that it's a nation of laws and not of men, and that includes you. Much as I like your judgment on many things,
Yes,
I mean, don't
yes.
get me wrong. If we were to institute a benevolent dictatorship, you would be high up on my list of people to oversee it. But that's besides the point.
You're about to be involved in one of those come August. But little inside joke there. Sorry. Well, okay. Here's what I'd say about that. Again, what you're doing here is saying, let's compare the ideal version of my view of things with the non-ideal version of your view of things. So if we're talking, ideal version to ideal version, yeah, we'd like to have this thing we call the rule of law, where we have a set of general rules that are as binding on the government as they are on the citizens, and all that good stuff. Now, I think it's hard to look at even something, as undramatic as the history of Obamacare. It's hard to look at the actions of the IRS and their flagrant abuse of their power, disregard for the Hatch Act, other things like that. The government's utter unwillingness to do things like police the borders, to actually fulfill its responsibilities, and say that we're operating under that sort of rule of law. So in a case where you have, as my friend Andy McCarthy pointed out yesterday, the enforcement of laws in a way that is not only selective and arbitrary, but very closely aligned with the political interests of the people that we're supposed to be entrusting as neutral arbiters of what the law is, it's hard for me to accept that we really have a real meaningful rule of law in that case. So and this may seem like an inflammatory phrase, but what you're calling for really amounts to unilateral disarmament.
No, what I'm suggesting is that if your argument is that because the regime under which we live is imperfect, which it is, and because the rule of law is not applied consistently, which it's not, and because the government is full of flawed men and there is some political and legal collusion, then Bundy is somehow entitled to some leeway of his own. And my suggestion is, okay, but then so is absolutely everybody else. It's not as if the situation you just described of arbitrary and capricious law doesn't apply in almost every area. It's not limited to the Bureau of Land Management, and I'm asking, what is therefore to stop somebody on the left breaking the law routinely, in fact everybody breaking the law routinely, because we live under this regime? I mean, if we live under this regime that is so far away from the standard that would be necessary for acquiescence, then why is the right to revolt limited to the people of which you approve?
Well, I don't think that it is, and again, I think that it's more a question of taking things on a case-by-case basis than trying to articulate some general principle from it. Although one of the things I was talking about yesterday, which I think is kind of amusing, is that there are a lot of people on the left, including people I've heard from, who are just livid about this situation. How dare this guy think he can just break the law? But in the case of, say, Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks and all that, they take it precisely the opposite view. And so much of this comes down to cultural matters, where people on the left look at someone like Bundy and can't imagine anyone thinking that's acceptable. People on the right look at someone like Snowden, can't imagine thinking that's acceptable. So yeah, I mean, we always have to get to the question of the underlying issue.
We do, because what you've just said is absolutely true, but that is ultimately a tu quoque argument.
Well,
You do it. You endorse it.
Actually, no. What I'm trying to take from this is the opposite of a tu quoque argument. So it's corresponding with one of my non-friends on the left yesterday about this very thing, and he said, well, Snowden was committing an act that was illegal as an act of protest against a government that's clearly violating its constitutional duties and the rights of its citizens and all this, whereas Bundy is just some hillbilly grifter who's trying not to pay his range fees. And even if you take that argument, it's still the same government.
No, but it is the same government, but there is a difference, I think, between disobeying the orders of a government that is violating a constitution that sits above it. I'm not, by the way, endorsing this view for Edward Snowden. I'm not sure what I think about Edward Snowden. This has been a long time I've been thinking about this, and I just can't work out what I think. So I'm going to throw my hands up and say that I'm useless on this question. But as a principle here, there is a difference, for example, between a citizen saying, I will not comply with you removing my firearms because the Constitution sits above whatever order you've been given, and somebody saying, for example, I am not going to obey the speed limit because it is too low. And the difference is that although one might not like either, the states clearly have the plenary powers to set the speed limit, and the government does not have the authority to take away the guns. So it does matter. I'm not saying your friend on the left is consistent, but it does matter that Edward Snowden ostensibly acted in order to protect the Fourth Amendment, but that Bundy, unless you're arguing that Bundy's was upholding the Constitution with his behaviour, it does matter that he was just breaking the law, right?
Well, again, I think you're making a legal argument here, and I'm not. So, as a matter of law, as a matter of legal and constitutional process, no doubt you are correct. And again, not to make a facile or unwarranted comparison, but just to illustrate the point, the people who were abetting and harboring fugitive slaves in the 19th century clearly were violating the law as well.
True.
And there was a constitution that stood above that law and, of course, endorsed it. So there are times when this sort of thing is called for. So I don't think there's any way for us to get away from the discussion of whether this is one of those times. And we're running a little long here, so I'll maybe get close to wrapping this up. But one thing you said earlier that I think I want to address, which is, no, I don't think the fact that the government is imperfect and staffed by imperfect men and has defective institutions, as all human institutions are, as we'll be thinking about tomorrow on Good Friday, even those of us who are not believers.
I've told you I'm an atheist who believes in original sin.
Yes, exactly.
I'm with you on this.
But there's a difference between a government which is imperfect, as they all are, and a government which is working in a way that is, I think, malicious. I think it's difficult to look at Lerner in the IRS case. I think it's difficult to look at Eric Holder. I think it's difficult to look at the NSA and come away with an argument that this is just, human imperfection writ at the federal level. I think you're talking about something else there. I'm kind of with you on the issue of Snowden, that I've gone, back and forth on this sort of thing. And I think the decision that I've come to on it is that, Snowden and Assange and Manning and those guys all strike me as fairly creepy and probably acting out of motives that I don't necessarily share. But I think in the long run, what they did is going to leave the country better off, and I'm glad that it happened.
Right, and this is, just to finish on this note about Edward Snowden, I've never understood the argument that discussion of the NSA and discussion of Edward Snowden have to be inextricable. I mean, Edward Snowden could have been the best human being that had ever lived, or the worst. He could have got to Russia and massacred 10,000 people, and yet we would still be able to benefit from what it is that he announced. He could have committed treason and been executed for it, or he could have been given, the presidential Medal of whatever it is, freedom, and he would nonetheless have provided precisely the same information and sparked precisely the same debates. And one thing this morning, maybe we should talk about this, in the future is watching the Snowden champions trip over themselves to pretend that his behavior in Russia with Vladimir Putin is anything other than abhorrent is bizarre, because it doesn't change the underlying debate about surveillance and about the American security state one whit.
No. One thing I do want to say in closing is that occasionally I am sad that these are only audio podcasts and not video podcasts. And I am a little bit today for this reason, because you were talking about you being a, Tory, rhino, sellout, newly suburban type conservative. And I note today it's an American flag tie, a Burberry sweater, and boat shoes. So we've got
my American flag belt.
So we've got something patriotic, something English, and something from the yacht club. So you're definitely wearing the look that you're being accused of.
I contain multitudes, Kevin.
Yes, indeed you do. All right, folks, we will talk to you tomorrow, and see you then.
Actually, I thought before we went I would list my 5 favorite Salon columns of the last week.
Please do.